Hello everyone, great to see you. My name is Mia Kim from Jeonju University. Today, I'm very honored to have a chance to make a presentation about what I've researched so far. The title of my research is The Analysis of Dominant Force of Trauma in the Category of Social and Political Background through the analysis of Jamaica Kincaid's representative novel, Lucy. Let me tell you the content. The first section is introduction part. In this part, I will tell you about the whole background of how trauma is formed and appeared to some people. And I will mention about the relationship between trauma and social and political circumstance. In second chapter, I want to tell you about the dominant force of trauma in social and political category. In this section, I will provide Judith Lewis Herman's definition to phenomenal symptoms of trauma, and I adapted his theory to research a consistent force of trauma in the category of social and political background. In the third chapter, I will tell you about the ambivalent symbol of trauma through the analysis of the representative symbol, daffodil, in this novel, Lucy. Here, I will analyze the double meaning of daffodils in Jamaica Kincaid's novel, Lucy. This paper examined ambivalent symbol of daffodils for Lucy, who represents all wandering people, including Black people, third world people, even immigrants all over the world now. And for Maria, who represents abusing the power like white people. In the first chapter, I want to tell you about the surmountable symbol of trauma through the research of the meaning of Lucy Josephine Porter, so Lucy's full name, and Tears and Water. In this section, this paper tried to seek for the meaning of Lucy's full name, like I mentioned, Lucy Josephine Porter, and the meaning of Tears and Waters. This research shows how Lucy can overcome the symptoms of trauma in the category of social and political and cultural relations. And finally, I will tell you about the conclusion of my research. Okay, then in introduction part, historically and politically being examined, trauma is deeply related with social and cultural circumstance. When suppressive war, colonization, and unexpected disaster of nature happen to people, they are prone to show some abrupt reaction to it, or they get unimaginable fear. These factors can be potential symptoms of trauma, and they get manifested later on. This phenomenon explicitly appears on Black people or third world people. So research on the first steps of historical and political trace, this research will look into how the trauma is formed into those targets and how they can get it over. Okay, let me move on to the next section. Dominant force of trauma in social and political category. Trauma, which is already engraved in some people, never goes away, even with constant and indomitable effort. It is not the matter of that it is personal or national issue in the category of human history. This is a matter of mental mechanism. Once trauma gets into someone's mind, it doesn't completely disappear. It unceasingly works on their mental representation. It appears again and again whenever they are exposed to any oppressive or unexpected situation similar to their traumatic experience. It cannot be easily solved out and recovered. With that reason, a lot of writers, including Jamaica Kincaid, tried to embrace their nation's instability and mental shock into their novels. They advocate to supply appropriate social and political scheme where their psychological scar can be healed. Judith Lewis Herman points out in his book, Trauma and Recovery, that trauma is an invisible obstacle which hinders someone's normal life. They tend to keep their exhausted life without realizing the entity, what bothers their mind. It is so natural that they become to get exhausted and inert step by step. They cannot have a stable relations with others in society because they show up proximal symptom in front of them and they themselves do not know why they have those symptoms. Until trauma gets to show some repetitive patterns, they are exposed to social bias and pain. As John and Bria also explains, traumatic people show up similar tendency in society, especially when it is in relation to the experience of trauma. They tend to be helpless. So it reminds them of terror, anger, and devastation they experienced in repetitive form. It hinders them from keeping social relationship as a human individual, and it finally leads them to lose self-esteem as a grown-up person. The lack of self-esteem and self-identity produces various types of side effects on traumatic people, and it makes them hesitate to make their own decision to start something in society. This can be connected with unstable relationship with their mother. People having a problem of mental shock or trauma tends to show wrong relationship with mother in the starting point of their life. This propensity was established based on the circumstance of diaspora and war, and it takes a long time to restore themselves. So this research targets on examining these tendencies of trauma in the context of social and political background. When it comes to this research, this paper analyzed one of Jamaica Kincaid's representative novel, Lucy. It looked into Lucy's escaping from a mother, diaspora life in unfamiliar land, and her gradual change as a mature person. Okay, then let me move on to next section. Ambivalent symbol of trauma through the analysis of representative symbol, the daffodil. As lots of studies explained above, trauma has the pattern of chronic and repetitive aspects. In Lucy, the novel Lucy, the character Lucy had to be out of this perpetrator's territory to get over this painful vicious cycle. Living home and being free from her mother could be the only way Lucy could take her own route for her future. Again, Guillermo indicates that persistent restraint to women or children in family can let them deviate from normal life, and it can eventually cause traumatic symptom to them. Once it bursts out, it is tenaciously appears and bothers their routine. As Moira mentioned, Jamaica Kincaid suggests on purpose the symbolic image of goodness through Maria in early part of this novel. This flow of story can give more dramatic effect on readers, and writers' messages can be conveyed to them more strikingly. Maria's pure and innocent image symbolizes colonizers' fancy illusion. Colonizers have a clear goal to incapacitate colonized ones to keep perpetual suppression and wield their power. Colonizers never acknowledge that they abuse their power to colonize nations. They only see the world in their point of view. So this study implicitly digs up most of this dominant structure in the category of social, historical, and cultural interrelations between colonizer and colonized ones. Lucy realizes truth in a time that she already has mother she loves, but she feels terrified the moment Lucy had heavy burden on her mother's love. Lucy once feels that Maria's love to her looks stronger than her mother's love to her. This way of attitude is very typical in the view of medical pathologist diagnosis on traumatic patient. In relation to Lucy's compatible behavior, John Brooks Bussen indicates as follows. Let me explain his assertion. This invisible but potential factor, which might turn up again in any time in life, is the worst enemy to maintain common life. This fear constantly suppresses diaspora people to be deviated from a stable routine of their life. It never perishes, and it only looks perishable. This possible risky factor interrupts traumatic person to hesitate to make some relationship in society and lets them ask questions to themselves if it is possible for them to coexist with other people. This realistic phenomenon hinders third world people or black people from sustaining normal relations, including family and even loved ones. In this novel, Lucy, daffodils mean the messenger of brightness for Maria. It simultaneously represents colonizers' suppression to Lucy. So it is impossible for Maria to understand Lucy's tragic experience on daffodils. So Maria only concentrates on herself and her world, not Lucy's world. Maria becomes an infuser, engraving her point of view to Lucy. Maria's attitude taking Lucy to the garden of daffodils is very symbolic, which shows up colonizers' persistent indirect oppression to the colonized ones. Lucy's shame and anger about daffodils exemplify how cultural structure in some society induces culturally impaired psychology of it. Likewise, daffodils have the ambivalent meaning for these two cultures, white and colored. Nancy Chodorow says, a psychological and cultural experience of childhood is accidental, filtered, personalized in some sudden psychological activity. Those activities are individually structured and revived in both each individual and culture. Lucy's remembrance on her life in a homeland dominated by English, stimulates her trauma, and it pokes up its repetitive pattern. Its repetitive pattern intermittently appearing on them. Daffodils are only objects of contempt to Lucy. Okay, let me move on. Surmounter symbol of trauma through the research of the meaning of research, Lucy Josephine Porter and Tears and Water. As Kincaid, Jamaica Kincaid insists that naming, renaming are necessary to Lucy for definition of the self, change of the self, possession of the self, and creation of the self. Josephine, let me explain the meaning of Lucy's full name. Josephine was named after her uncle, Joseph, made a fortune by sugarcane farm but died of poverty. And Potter was named after the owner of her slave ancestors. When Lucy asked to her mother the reason how she could get the name, her mother explained the background of the birth of the name Lucy. She says that it is quoted from the Bible, Satan, Lucifer. What Lucifer's mother explained about her name conjures up her illegitimate identity, and Lucy accepts herself as she is now. However, Lucy finally accepts the insulting name of Lucifer. She confesses that she has emotionally changed into a new and determined person, getting out of old and exhausted feeling ever since she accepted the real meaning of her name. Lucy links Lucifer's bad identity and power, who was made to challenge existing order and rules like Satan, to herself. Lucy, in reverse, derives a victory from failure. She becomes actively involved in her name. As Lucifer settled down in new land, Lucy becomes to accept her life and settle down in new land. She starts to get stable and move on her life positively. Lucy's anger against the mother and her devastation on her homeland has conquered most of her life, but she needs to reconcile with her inner self-ego in order to be reborn in this new world. Jamaica Kincaid puts out Lucy as a totally different human being, having her own stable self-ego by being reborn. Lucy can be broken away from the confinement of colonizers' dominance. So Kincaid uses devices of water and tear to let Lucy see the light in word. Sigmund Freud insists that the period of mourning for traumatic people is necessarily required to get over its symptom and to be out of it. So Jamaica Kincaid implicitly shows people for women's future through Lucy's tears, having the message of change. Okay, then let me tell you the conclusion of my research. As it is examined through whole process of this research, Lucy is representative figure of third world people who have had serious mental shock cause of political and social absurdity oppressing them in reality. The reality full of absurdity, recklessness, inhumanity, unceasingly suppressed the third world people, especially women who had double oppression in family and in society, and the social and cultural atmosphere made them wonders. They had deep hurt in their soul. They were political and social victims, and this circumstance became the seed of their trauma. Third world people's diaspora life drifting away here and there was very similar to that of Black people in American society. The social and political scheme they belonged to was overwhelmed with insult and inhumanity, and it naturally gave birth to trauma. So this study looked into trauma appearing on third world people or Black people through the examination of Lucy's growth in the context of social and political background. The symptoms of trauma were being expressed in the form of individual potent or collective potent. With the movement of time and space, trauma, which had been trapped in traumatic people's subconsciousness, tends to reveal its entity and comes to surface consistently. By analyzing trigger factors which stimulate the suppressed trauma, this study suggests an opportunity to lay the groundwork for quantum leap. As a way of possible solution, this research encourages to establish cultural and social mechanism for diaspora people suffering from trauma in the category having the limit of social and political movement. Okay, this is the conclusion of my research. While I'm researching this paper, I usually focused on her Judith Louis Herman's and Nancy Childers' theory. Okay, and thank you so much. Thank you.